quite an unprecedented environment in the lives of people all over the globe. So certain thoughts that came to my mind as a history teacher and as a history researcher and a student. This pandemic period, that is a COVID times, taught me certain things. And I just had a rumination over some of the thoughts that came to my mind. And this take a different turn in the sense that, I talked on pandemics and history during some webinars prior to this, but this lecture is actually different from that. In this lecture, I am trying to address some of the issues that are epistemologically relevant for the method and methodology of writing history. Because pandemics have always influenced the human civilization. Pandemics definitely influenced the historical processes and changes all over the world. But COVID-19 is different. COVID-19, which takes its abbreviation from coronavirus disease 2019, is very different pandemic in the sense that the world is intensely connected now. Intensely connected in the sense that, it affects the people in the Amazon forest, it affects people in major cities all over the world, in the villages, irrespective of the domain. So it reaches everywhere. The virus has practically conquered the globe as a whole, and all systems have come to a standstill. I wish to call this phase of the pandemic as, as a post period in history, as a post period in human civilization, like you pause your audio or video instrument or mechanism. The entire life is paused. But when life and life activities are paused, you can see that, new thoughts are coming into the mindscapes of the people. Everywhere you can witness that people are thinking differently. And they are also appearing differently with the mask, in social distancing, in definite cues, differentiating, one person from the other person. And some people being quarantined. So it makes totally different environment. It makes a totally different human environment. It makes a totally different relationship all over the world. But what comes to my mind? My mind is, the ways of thinking of people, right from leaders who are at the top apex governmental positions, state positions, and also to those persons who are too marginalized in the society. Irrespective of the social status, people are thinking ways of overcoming this particular pandemics. Everyone is thinking now to get rid of the unprecedented situation, because this is not a situation like the floods which we witnessed, or the cyclones or hurricanes which witnessed the regions in different parts of the world. Governments are trying the best to find a solution to this. Big institutions are thinking in terms of some structural adjustments in their management. Agencies are thinking. Individuals are also thinking. You can see that the farmers are thinking about, making their product reach the markets, through certain digital platforms. They are also trying to open their spaces in digital spheres. Businessmen are trying for that. Hoteliers are doing a very different job now, because most of them are switching over to delivery of food items to homes. Common workers are also thinking. Teachers are especially, they're very busy with, installing platforms, digital platforms for their online teaching, irrespective of the teacher, whoever be the teacher belonging to the physics department or the commerce or the history department, everyone is busy installing new digital platforms. Doctors are doing a different job, not a different job in the sense that, their attitude towards patients differ in that sense, because they are also they are also confronting a new crisis in the scenario of health management. Builders are adjusting, cinema people are adjusting the environment through taking films, with a very limited crew and not going for external or shootings in external areas. In indoors, cinemas are being shot in indoors. Children are trying to get acclimatized to the new environment. Either they're busy with their hobbies or they're busy with their internet games, whatever be like that. So everyone is thinking the life has changed, the lifestyle has changed in a wide variety of spheres of human life. That's why I told there is no distinction in that. That is why I consider this period as a great post period. And people are also thinking in terms of, thinking in terms of inventing a vaccine for combating and containing this virus, arresting the virus and its spread. So everywhere in the world, the momentum, the activities that are going are deeply connected with the COVID phase of human civilization. No, now you cannot say that this is a post-COVID phase. This is a COVID phase in that sense. And now, when confronted with this, a whole new culture of relations and relationships have emerged. New motives have emerged. I used to abbreviate, the present social lexicon or the culture of the present globe as MSDQ, that is, mask into social distancing into quarantine is today's world. You have the mask as the motive, as a symbol, which differentiate you from what you were before March 23rd, the cutoff date, the day on which the lockdown was, declared in India, March 24th. So on March 23rd and March 24th, you are two different human beings. Wearing a mask, people are everywhere, people are wearing masks. People are coming with new types of masks. For example, people in the Nilgiris, the Toda tribals, they have come with new embroidered masks, and they are selling it through their outlets. In the Amazon forest, poor people are using banana leaves, steamed banana leaves to cover up their faces because masks are not available there. So the mask culture denotes that your identity, that the face identity has changed, in that sense. It's very difficult to recognize people in that sense. Now you have the social distancing, that is the practice as a therapeutics. We are following social distancing as there is no vaccine to prevent the infection. And you also go to extreme forms of social isolationism, which you practiced in the medieval times or in the early medieval times, the quarantine. So you see that, a new panopticon has emerged in that sense. It can be compared to a new digital architecture of surveillance. A new digital architecture of surveillance is there. And there comes the importance of the terms and terminologies that you use now. That is the mask, the social distancing, or the quarantine, or confinement, whatever terms and terminologies which we use today in the daily life, where that carries a much cultural weight on its part. In that sense, the history of the present is deeply connected with the past through these terms. For example, in the 1970s, in the post-1970s, we came to confront with a new consciousness, which is called the planetary consciousness, arising out of the need to save the planet from environmental, disastrous environmental crisis in that sense, all over the world. So we know that how the lexicon developed with the establishment of the British rule in India, how a new, what you call arrangement of words came, like forestry department, supervision, control regimes, and particular scientific terms which they used in order to denote that to describe the kind of environment in India. So every time, that's why I wish to revert to the 1970s. In the post 1970s, you have a number of books authored by great historians on environmental history, because every time the present has got a much bearing on the art of writing, art and science of writing history. So the present lexicon, the use of new words, repeated use of new words, which we were using these words earlier in a very different terrain, but now this is very much inextricably connected with your sensibilities, your mindset and collective consciousness. So I argue that lexicography and historiography in that sense goes hand in hand, because the art of writing history, the science and method or methodology of writing history, is deeply entrenched in understanding the meanings of certain words, not in the common parlance, but historically. So that is why MSDQ, mask, social distancing, and quarantine are very crucial terms for understanding historiographical departures which are going to happen in these COVID times and also in the post-COVID times. When I say the post-COVID times, I'm rather hesitant to use the term post-COVID times, but post-COVID times in the sense that, once this COVID scenario is over, I don't know at what time that is to happen, because vaccine has not been, invented so far in that sense. But anyway, human civilization will overcome these times, and we will have a post-COVID times to denote a different kind of world in thinking, in mentality, and in practices. So what will be the fate of history in those times is the concern of this lecture. Now, I am paraphrasing, I am schematizing my lecture into three different segments. The one is that, you look at the way in which the environment in the archives changes. What was the historian or the historical researcher or the student doing in the archives in the pre-COVID times? And what the historian and the researcher is going to do in the post-COVID times? So is there any difference between the historian of the pre-COVID times and the post-COVID times, before March 23rd and after March 24th? I see that there is an immense possibility of understanding the documents which are there in a different manner after March 24th, that is in the post-COVID period. This may lead to new readings and new analysis of the documents of the past pandemics in that sense. So there is a turn in the archives that is going to happen in the post-COVID times based on the experiences of the historian. Historian was also a person who is living in the COVID times. So naturally, he will also have an experience of living in the COVID times. So what is going to happen is a turn in the archives, means, a turn in the mindset of the historian, a turn in the approach of the historian towards the documents is to happen in the post-COVID times. How the historian experienced the pandemics in the world and how he look at the records in a very differentiated manner. So the documented histories which are supposed to be dead in the archives, which carry a meaning which was attributed to it by an older time, the olden time, that is being presented before the historian who is living in the present in that sense. So as the pandemic emotion is revisiting the social world, the historian who, for example, a historian who was working in the on before March 24th in the archives, for example, for instance, some historians who are consulting some documents, political documents in the archives before March 24th, and coming to the certain documents, in that sense, he come across or very accidentally he chances upon certain documents which are related to the pandemics, for example, malaria in India. But a historian is concerned about, the researcher is concerned about, the documents related to, for example, the national movement in that sense, maybe the civil disobedience movement or the Quit India movement in that sense. But when he or she comes to see, chances upon these document, that is a document which is related to the pandemics or policies which were taken by the government to contain malaria or smallpox or any other kind of contagious disease like the plague. Naturally, he may read it for some time and leave it there because that is not his business. That's a way in which the historian think in that sense. Because my problem is not the problem of malaria. My problem is not the problem of quarantine. So he goes ahead with his documents like political documents, consultancy files, proceedings of assemblies and such as the regulatory bodies in that sense, or some secret files of the correspondence between government officials, things like that. But once, the same historian going to the archives in the post-COVID period, that is after March 24th, imagine that the archives is open now. When you go to the archives now and when you encounter, when you came across some of the sources were related to some sort of pandemics or the governmental regulations which were to control and contain the pandemics, naturally, the historian gets interested in that. The researcher, because of his experience in the COVID times, because of the experiential element of history in him, naturally, there is a tendency on the part, there will be a tendency on the part of the researcher to go through such documents and, if possible, to integrate that document with the political history that he is engaging with that. So, the borders of political history or his impression of the sources, his understanding of the sources gets transcended into other borders also. So that leads to a crisscrossing or a cross-fertilization of ideologies and methodologies and approaches in historiography. So this is a point I wish to move this point because the archives sometimes, present a present tense inside the archives. Usually the archives turns to be something like a new laboratory for the historian. So usually the archives, talk to you in the past tense, but the archives at this particular point of time talk to you in the present tense because you are an experienced person with the pandemics. So the records which are there concerning the pandemic, concerning an infectious diseases, concerning malaria or plague, whatever be the files that come across you, accidentally or by chance, may impact you on a very significant level, on a higher level of signification in the post-COVID period. This is the environment of this leads to changes in the environment of the archives. The architecture of the archives or the mental apparatus within which you work in the archives is a different one now in that sense. So that is why in the post-COVID period, there will be a tendency, there will be a realization of old pandemic. I'm not saying that, people are going to do research or, they're going to proceed with research in the coronavirus pandemic, this period. But the thing is that generally the interest of the historian is determined by certain structural changes in the society. The episteme has changed in that sense, The notions about the documents past documents have changed. The notions about approaches to historical problems, definitely that will have a tremendous impact, and that will definitely change in the post-COVID times. So the first thing that I argue is that the environment inside the archives itself will be a different environment, felt environment for the historian in the post-COVID times. And naturally, the experiences of the historian, makes it possible for a new reading of the documents which are, housed or conserved in the archives. Because that is very interesting to note that, this happens everywhere. This happens everywhere. That is why, depending on the periods, there is a period classification of historiography, Foucault, who lived in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, had he lived in the 18th century, he would not have been a Foucault like as we feel and experience today. Because the context of the present of the 18th century or the 19th century will definitely impact the context of the historian. And that will definitely impact the text of the historian too. So every time you can see that such histories have definitely led to immense changes in the methods and methodologies and approaches of the historian. For example, as I told you about the emergence of environmental history in the 1970s all over the world, and in 1980s, especially in the context of the forest regulation, the forestry bill of 1980s, which led to serious debates in all over India, all over Indian nation regarding the pros and cons of reservation and how it affects the poor people or the people who are surviving on forest resources. In that sense, that led to an interest in forest history. So the context is going to impact. So that is why I tell you that the archives and the documents are going to tell a different story in the coming days. And new studies in that sense will definitely emerge, where you can see and experience how the documents talk to you differently and how you approach the documents differently. Because the document which was supposed to be the creation of a different context is encountering a context which is similar to that. So the historian who is going to the 14th century records, standing in the 21st century, may feel more emotionally attached or sensitively attached to the documents of the 14th century, which we deal mainly with the bubonic plague and the Black Death. So that is one point which I wish to stress here. The second is something like turntables in historiography. In the post-COVID times, already you can see that you will come across a lot of quarantine studies, quarantine histories, beautiful works, dealing with quarantine history of the 14th century, 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries are there. Now there will be a reinforcement of the ideology of historiography dealing with such studies in that sense, So the histories of confinement, histories of social exclusion will be coming to the historian, the tables of the historian in a different manner. So one such study, a possible study that is to impact in the post-COVID times is the quarantine studies. Secondly, you can read the earlier forms of histories in a very different manner. For example, a student or researcher who is busy with studying colonialism, the colonialism can be read from a very different note, looking at the colonial policies towards environment and health. I am not saying that no studies have come in so far. There are some brilliant works that deal with the pandemics which spread during the colonial times and how the colonizer or the British administration tried to cope up with that in that sense, also leading to a kind of a racialization of quarantining or racialization of the environment in that sense, So those stories will definitely reappear, and a whole new series of works connected with colonialism. So colonialism will be interpreted on a very different terrain in the coming years. And then individual stories from the past can be brought to light. For example, one branch of discipline, historical discipline, that is to take, a turn. That means a very radical turn is oral historiography, because you get to know about the pandemic experiences of people from testimonies in that sense. So one thing that is sure and certain is that people will definitely try for understanding such pandemics, such infectious diseases, or a disease, a localized infectious diseases, something like the chikungunya, which spread all through Kerala in the 2007. So such local issues will also be problematized in the coming days. That will tell a very different story in that sense, because next it is said that next to your doorstep there is an archives in that sense. And thirdly, pandemics, quarantine may also lead historians to cope up with new issues like the social stratification in India. How do you look at quarantining of the body, a particular body in India? For example, the untouchables, the Shudras. So how caste factors led to a quarantined social context in India. So I'm saying I am discussing certain possible ways of turning historiography in the coming years. So you cannot say that this is just the pandemic history, but this is the history of human civilization. So another branch, a major branch, which is to receive, an impetus or an impact, will be definitely history of mentalities. No serious works have been engaged in India concerning the history of mentalities, but history of mentalities will be revived in the sense that, in dealing with collective consciousness of the people, because one consciousness rules the whole world now. That is the collective trauma. The psychological factor, the fear factor, the emotion. So histories of emotions will reappear. Histories about death will reappear. Histories about new sensibilities will reappear. So a whole new terrain of studies will definitely advance in a more rigorous manner in the post-COVID times, taking cue from the impact of the pandemic on historiography. Now, you just for a brief, take a pause and look at, the people, the marginalized people who suffered maximum during very miserable days. They always have miserable days. Miseries are there as their language, but they have suffered immensely, on a wide scale during the coronavirus epidemic, this pandemic. You can see that people were walking 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers, and something like, you witnessed people in the highways, like the highway citizens. So there can be a tendency among a positive tendency among many historians to deal with the subaltern history on a different terrain. I think even a new subaltern historiography school will develop in order to interrogate the problems connected with these people, the highway subalterns. So new orientations can be there in that sense also. Now, pushing back to new sources, because pandemics always reveal a story which is emotively very, very intimate in that sense. For example, you have a lot of cinema, movies, and documentaries connected with the plague, connected with the Spanish flu, and such other diseases, all over the world. So cinemas, because the books and the archival documents may not be expressing and may not be transmitting the emotional charge of the pandemic-stricken people, but cinema tell a different story, because cinema tell individualized stories also. Cinema narrates the stories of the health people, doctors, nurses who fought the battle against the pandemic. So there, the pandemic, the virus becoming a villain in that sense, and there are people who try to transmit the viruses in that sense. So there will be a search for these kind of movies like the Black Death, Contagion. You know about the movie Contagion. You know about the Malayalam movie, the virus. So all these movies can also be considered as sources for history, for constructing the histories of the pandemic times in that sense, because that they follow a different kind of representation in that sense. You may think that it is a fictive representation or it's a fiction, matter of fiction, but fiction carries a lot of weight in the time of pandemics. So many novels were written during the time of the great pandemics, for example, on the plague. The plague that is written by Camus is an example where you can understand the pandemics from a very emotional level in that sense, a representation, literal representation in that sense. You can also see how Satyajit Ray, directed Ganshatru, a film which portrays the story of a doctor who found that an infected water inside a temple pond is a reason for hepatitis in the area, but he was later, he was actually socially excluded, and he became an enemy of the people in that sense. So many films, movies, novels, such kind of literature, which carries a different narrative, a narration about the pandemics will be the new sources that will definitely re-emerge. Already people are using such sources, but those sources will be very widely used in the post-COVID times, the films, documentaries, and such other literary forms. Because for understanding pain, fear, and isolationism, sometimes the visuals tell a very different story in that sense. That's why these kind of sources are very vital. I am implicating about the shift in the interest towards these kind of visual sources, like Hayden White comments about the history of 40, that is understanding history through photographs and movies in that sense. So this may lead to a new structure and institutionalized management of a visual archives in that sense. So new archives and new museums which embody these emotions most vigorously may also reappear, may appear in the coming days. Not the usual heritage museums that we have now, but museums and archives which record the testimonies of the people of the pandemics in these times. So a whole new set of what you call methods and methodologies will definitely be coming back to history. Now, another, I am highlighting certain tendencies that may emerge in the post-COVID times concerning the writing of history. That's what I am doing now. And then you can also see that the postmodern theories may be reinforced in historiography. Because in the post-Second World War period, there was a revision of historiography due to the impact of postmodernism. The notions of progress are criticized. The notions of progress are, found to be false, coming from false premises. So similarly, people can also criticize the notions of development. What we were looking at before in the pre-COVID times, looking at the edifices, looking at the facades of development, that may be brought under a critic of the historian also. So historian goes to the roots of these problems in that sense, So postmodern methodologies of historiography, which serve the purpose of an emancipatory kind of methodology, may get reinforced in the coming scenario of history writing. And another tendency which I see, that is ever since the Black Death and Spanish influenza episodes, the discipline history got easily integrated with medical history, in the sense that the boundaries of disciplines are too porous in that sense. So people can move from one discipline to other discipline for understanding the impact of pandemics. The pandemics cannot be understood fully by the historian. The historian will definitely have to to search for the methods and methodologies in sciences also for understanding the pandemics, because pandemics is not not simply a political or social or cultural thing. Of course, it has its manifestations like that, but the pandemics, it carries a lot of science with it. So creation of new histories and studies will be markedly different from the earlier periods, because I understand, as far as I understand, there will be a merging of methodologies and methods from history, medicine, and sciences in that sense, more particularly medicine, and then to the sciences also. So history will be definitely, historical methodologies will be recharged with inputs from medicine, with inputs from other sciences like epidemiology in that sense to create a new kind of history in the coming period. That is why I tell the transcending boundaries of historian, because we have seen during the pandemics that how the maps changed in that sense. A person living in Kottayam district, one fine morning comes to understand that he cannot move to Ernakulam district, that because that is closed for the Kottayam people like that. So, like that, new maps are created in that sense. A person living in India comes to understand that he is living in India with coronavirus. Same time, the people who live in China or Pakistan also, they also live with coronavirus. So now what is the case of these boundaries in that sense? These are all fixed boundaries based on certain political ideals and certain political conditioning of the society. So disciplines, discipline history is to vigorously, transform in through imbibing, through adapting to the new methodologies. In that sense, truly interdisciplinary historiography will emerge. Sometimes you feel like that this history writing is not sensible to the conventional historiography in the pre-COVID times. So that is yet another development, possible development that is to happen in the coming days. And more than that, there is also a tendency that there emerges a new narrative for history in the post-COVID times. Because the factual histories that you narrate may have, fictionalized statements in it, overtones in it, in the sense that, because largely the history of pandemics, fear about the death, etc. Like Giovanna Bors argues in the cultural history of fear, it talks a very different kind of history in that sense. So the narrative of history is also to get transformed in the sense that when you say that, this is a factual history which is solidly based on documents, of the past, rigorous analysis of documents. Even that factual history can have fiction in it in that sense. So a condition may emerge, in future that a fictionalized history will have more factuality in it than a factualized history. So that may also lead to a new kind of, writing history, the style of writing history, the use of words and the expressive forms of structures also may change in the coming days, because that's why I tell you that a new narrative may emerge in the coming days. So there are chances that history integrate with medical history. We have seen that, many medical surgeons and doctors are writing histories of plague and histories of Spanish influence like that. So it will definitely get integrated with science, technology, and finally that history will be connected to the histories of health and restoration of health. Something connected with the health is very important for you to understand. So a branch that may emerge as a distinctive branch in historiography in the coming days may be public health history of public health in that sense, because we have experienced the importance of public health management system, especially in Kerala, in the light of the coronavirus disease and its spread out. So we are what we are today because of the public health management system is so strongly established and institutionalized in our tiny state in that sense. So public health histories, integration of history with technology, science, and medical knowledge will definitely lead to a new branch of historiography, which will definitely create what you call as something like an applied history. Now you have applied chemistry, applied material sciences like that. Now you will have an applied history also in that sense, because the history that is applied, which narrate a different story of emotions, a different story of sensibilities, a different story of feeling like pain, things like that. So that will be more vital, more significant and crucial in the coming years, coming days. And coming to the theorization of history part, now you, as I suggested and advanced in the introductory stage of my lecture, the body itself becoming a problem for you. How you look at the infectious body. the body will definitely resurface in historiography as a text for many analysis and interpretations. Because the body is very significant, the human body is very significant. It is a site of disease and it is a site of, exerting power. Because the body factor, why I'm saying the body factor is that, the quarantined bodies in the medieval times, in the early modern times, revealed certain other prejudices also, in the sense that, a white body was usually considered to be less infectious in the 16th and 17th centuries. So naturally, that body would be quarantined for 10 or 14 days, while a black body or a Asian body or African body was quarantined for 40 days in that sense. So the body, the studies of body is very important in that sense, So new historiographies will definitely address this problem of understanding and analyzing body as a site for investigation, the body itself as an investigation site. These are some of the possible and plausible methodologies which may emerge in the future. And like that also, the confinement, the confinement, for example, Foucault has written, immensely on confinement and how confinement reached and how surveillance, mechanisms, how that meddled with the privacies of individuals, how knowledge was connected to power in that sense, and who were confined in that sense, and the emergence of the panopticon or the surveillance mechanism. So now you can understand this more intensely, because now your body is also, under surveillance. Be it an infected body or a non-infected body, this is also brought under surveillance in that sense, So a historian of power, a historian of social confinement, in the post-COVID periods may be more advantageously positioned in order to understand, because as I told you, advanced earlier, he is also an experienced body in that sense, The historian or the researcher himself is an experienced person. So that experiential form of knowledge, which the historian received through standing in a particular locale, will be a new input for the historian to turn the tables of historiography in that sense. So new theorizations will definitely emerge in that sense, So new theories of surveillance in that sense, what is called digital surveillance, how that can be connected with the surveillance of the prison or the mental asylums, as Foucault argued, So a whole new set of architectures emerged in order to understand the forms of power, notions of knowledge, notions of disciplining the body, so on and so forth. So now another important thing that comes to my mind is that perhaps you may ask me, earlier also pandemics were there. But what is the difference between the earlier pandemics and the pandemic of the 21st century, that is a coronavirus? Because there is a possibility that as historians and philosophers advocate these days, they argue these days, like Yuval Noah Harari argues that, what we are going to see or what we want is global integration in that sense. Not global disintegration, but global integration. Because only with the coming of this pandemic, that is COVID-19, that you feel that the world is so connected in that sense. So if the world is connected in that sense, then definitely the discipline history also will be connected. So there is no point in saying that this is a localized disease, which Kerala is to manage like this. No, it is not like that. A historian or a researcher who is dealing with, such kind of an infectious disease or an epidemic in a particular region is well trained to understand its connectivity all over the world now. So global history, as argued by the Annals school, has resurfaced with an urgency these days in order to understand human historical civilization, crisis in civilization, understand processual changes, understand societal changes. You need to have a connected history in that sense, which ultimately emerge as the total history argued by Fernand Braudel. So these are some of the arguments which I place before you to understand. And I'm not saying that in the post-COVID period, people are going to do maximum histories on the pandemics or infectious diseases. People are going to neglect political history and social history or cultural history. No, the thing is that there is an immense possibility that your political history gets connected to the history of health, history of diseases in that sense. That's what I'm saying. Specialized studies also will emerge in that sense. Recently, a student came to me, get for my advice on doing a topic, something like the malaria disease in India, how malaria spread in India. So from a different environmental point of view, we can look at this problem. So there is a tendency. Now, people are thinking in that direction. That will definitely happen. That will lead to specialized studies of, pandemics and these kind of endemic diseases. At the same time, what is my argument is that other kinds of history, like political, economic, social, and cultural histories, also will definitely reflect on the histories of health, on the histories of diseases, and histories of pandemics. So in that way also, the fields and subfields of history, because of the new sensibilities, experiential forms of sensibilities, experience of the pandemic, that the lived realities of the historian of today is impacting. Because every history that you write is not the history of the past in that sense. History is actually a discipline which examines the past, but that examination comes from the present context. So every history is presentist in that sense. So the present tense of history is going to be revealed on an intensive term, which will be definitely different from the kind of histories and historiography that you were engaging in the pre-COVID times, because the world is connected. It's a universalization of historiographical, what you call notions will again emerge in that sense, because the virus knows no boundaries. The virus have no maps in that sense. It reaches everywhere. It infects everyone in that sense. Only thing is that you can have a secluded or what you call a confined life in order to save your life in that sense. But collectively, the collective consciousness, the consciousness of trauma, social trauma, will definitely promote histories, migrate from one region to another region. Sometimes the histories that you take in a macro level can also revert to a micro level histories in that sense. So a pandemic study of pandemic in a general format, in a macro level, may also your arguments from a very local level also. So it goes macro and from the macro.
Sir, 1 second, please.
Histories of social confinement in that sense. For example, some of the beautiful histories were written in confinement. For example, Brodel wrote Mediterranean while he was in prison. And he said, I wrote Mediterranean for my imprisonment. If there was no imprisonment in the case of Brodel, he said, I would have written another book in that sense. Gramsci wrote on 33 notebooks, which finally culminated as the prison notebook in that sense, while in imprisonment. Rousseau philosophized about many of his ideologies while he was quarantined. So there are many examples from the world. I'm not saying that a historian needs to be quarantined for writing a beautiful history, but I'm saying that the post period gives you immense possibility, immense opportunity to reflect in a very different terrain and go to different domains in order to write new critical histories which are seriously different from the earlier kind of conventional histories or non-conventional histories that you were writing. So this intense connectivity will be reflected in historiography also. Virus taught to the world that the world is intensely connected. So definitely the pandemics will definitely impact the historiography as it had happened never before in that sense. So a never before experience is there for the historians to ponder into the questions connected with health, death, restorative techniques, medicine, social relations, confinement, and a plethora of documents will be there. So now as a last step, I wish to tell you that, perhaps you may think that, whether the historian is going to write the history of coronavirus standing in the present, because usually there is a tendency for the historian to think that, document become historical only if it matures through, say, for example, 50 years. So what the historian is going to do with the present coronavirus, documents, it's absolutely a nonsensical for the historian. People may think like that. It is not like that. Because what I am arguing is that a document on the virus, a document on the containment of the virus, a document on a death regarding happened in the coronavirus period, what happened just yesterday becomes a historical document today. So you can't say that a document matures with the passage of time. For example, a document has to be created in the 1940s in order to understand its value of history in these times. No, it's not like that. So that's why I tell you that the present time, the post time, is a great post time for the historian to ponder questions on themes and concepts and problems related to the pandemics. Not only the present pandemics, but also the pandemics which wrecked the life of people, human civilization in the past. Thank you very much. I stop here.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the excellent presentation.
Thank you.